October 12, 1944, dawned as an ordinary morning at Camp Huntsville in Texas, a military installation situated in the heart of Texas countryside that would soon become the stage for one of the most unexpected stories of human connection to emerge from the Second World War. A military transport truck, its engine rumbling with steady determination, made its way through the imposing gates of the camp, carrying inside it 43 German women who had been captured during the relentless Allied advance through occupied France just weeks earlier. These were not frontline combat troops or ideological zealots. These were auxiliary service members of the Wehrmacht, radio operators, administrative personnel and support staff who had found themselves on the wrong side of history at precisely the wrong moment. The women inside the truck were exhausted from their long journey, frightened about what their captivity would entail, and completely unprepared for the extraordinary series of events that were about to unfold before them. The truck pulled to a halt in the central compound of the camp, and the canvas covering was methodically pulled back, exposing the prisoners to their American captors for the first time since their capture. What happened in those initial 60 seconds would become a story whispered between prisoners, discussed in guards' barracks, and eventually told and retold for generations to come, as a moment that seemed to challenge every preconceived notion both nations held about each other. Before we delve deeper into this remarkable tale of cultural collision and unexpected humanity, we would love to know where you are watching this story from. Please take a moment to share your location in the comments below, as we value hearing from our viewers around the world. 22-year-old Greta Schneider sat near the back of the transport truck on that momentous October morning, clutching tightly to a small cloth bag that contained absolutely everything she owned in the world. She had served as a radio operator in occupied France, a position that required skill and attention to detail, believing wholeheartedly in the propaganda she had been fed about the sacred duty of defending the fatherland from what they were told were weak and decadent Americans. The Reich's propaganda machine had been remarkably thorough in its deception. She had been systematically told that American soldiers were soft and undisciplined, that they lacked the physical prowess and mental toughness of German troops, and that capture by Americans would inevitably result in abuse, humiliation, and suffering beyond imagination. As she gathered her courage and prepared to step down from the truck onto foreign soil, she braced herself mentally for the worst possible treatment she could imagine. What she saw instead made her freeze midway through her descent, her eyes widening to their full extent in genuine shock and disbelief. Standing in perfect military formation before the truck, arranged like living statues, were the American guards who had been assigned to oversee the women's compound. At the front of this impressive lineup stood Sergeant Mike O'Reilly, a formidable figure who had worked as a steelworker in Chicago before his military service, standing at 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 230 pounds of what appeared to be solid muscle earned through years of factory work. Standing directly beside him was Private Tommy Wilson from Alabama, measuring 6 feet 2 inches in height and possessing the kind of muscular build that came from operating heavy farm equipment before he had enlisted in the Army. Corporal James Henderson, who hailed from Minnesota, looked so powerfully built that he genuinely appeared as though he could lift the military transport truck entirely by himself through sheer physical strength. The entire row of guards towered over anything Greta or any of her fellow prisoners had ever imagined or encountered, even in their wildest fantasies. These were not the malnourished, physically inferior Americans that had stared back at them from the propaganda posters plastered throughout their barracks in France. These were giants, real and present, standing before them with an undeniable physicality that contradicted everything they had been taught. Behind Greta, in the cramped truck bed, 20-year-old Liesl Hoffman whispered urgently in German, her voice trembling with a nervous energy that reflected the shock coursing through all of them. She said in a hushed tone that they were absolutely enormous, and that the propaganda had never mentioned anything remotely resembling what stood before them now. Several of the other women murmured their agreement with nervous intensity, their initial fear of imprisonment mixing with deep confusion about the massive contradiction between what they had been told and what their eyes were now reporting to their brains. If their leaders had lied so blatantly and obviously about this physical fact that was impossible to deny or reinterpret, what else had been a lie? This fundamental question began to crack the foundation of their indoctrination in that very moment. But it was 19-year-old Frida Klein who made the completely unexpected decision to break the tension that had settled over them like a heavy blanket. Speaking in quiet German to those around her, she said something profound that would ultimately change the entire dynamic of what was supposed to be a grim and formal prison reception. She said that she had thought Americans were supposed to be weak and small, But looking at the sergeant standing at the front of the formation, she thought that one could probably use her as a toothpick without much effort. Despite their very real fear about what captivity would mean, several of the women let out small nervous laughs that seemed to bubble up from deep within them. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. The complete and utter contradiction between what they had been told and what stood unmistakably before them was simply too much to process without finding some release valve for the intense emotions they were experiencing. The laughter that escaped their lips became their first act of rebellion against everything they had been taught to believe. It represented a tiny crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of lies that had shaped their entire understanding of the world and the enemy they were supposed to hate. The morning of October 13th brought the women their first full day of established camp routine, and with it came new opportunities to continue their quiet observations of the Americans who now controlled every aspect of their daily lives. Breakfast was served in the large mess hall, a long building constructed of sturdy wooden timbers with long tables and benches that reminded Greta vividly of the school cafeteria back in Berlin, where she had eaten lunch as a schoolgirl. The food itself delivered another profound shock to their expectations. Generous portions of eggs, thick slices of bread, and even some fresh fruit sat before each woman on their metal trays. Many of the women had been subsisting on sparse military rations for months, as Germany's resources had become increasingly depleted, and the sudden abundance of food seemed almost obscene in its generosity. As they ate in quiet groups scattered throughout the mess hall, trying to maintain their dignity despite their circumstances, the guards rotated methodically through the dining space on patrol, as required by camp regulations. And the women could not help but continue their hushed observations about the remarkable physical size of their American captor. Frida had appointed herself the unofficial commentator on this phenomenon of American largenes, perhaps because humor had always been her instinctive way of coping with frightening situation and the unknown. Speaking in rapid German that only her table-mate could hear, she provided a running commentary analysis as different guards passed by their table during their patrol. She gestured subtly toward Corporal Henderson and remarked that he looked like someone who wrestled bears as a regular form of entertainment or recreation. Then she indicated Private Wilson and suggested that she bet he consumed an entire cow for his breakfast each morning. Despite the seriousness of their circumstances and their imprisonment, the women seated at her table struggled to suppress their giggles at the absurdity of these observations. There was something deeply comforting about making jokes together, about focusing on anything normal in a situation that was completely abnormal and frightening. Private Tommy Wilson, now 23 years old and still quite naive about the wider world, had noticed something unusual during his morning patrol through the camp. The German prisoners kept looking at him and the other guards repeatedly, then whispering to each other with expressions that did not at all match what he had been told to expect from enemy captives. They did not look angry or defiant or hostile, as he had been led to believe prisoners should look. Instead, they looked almost amused and curious about something they were observing. Tommy had never been outside the state of Alabama before he joined the army, and he certainly had never interacted with foreign prisoners of war from another nation. He had been thoroughly briefed to expect hardened Nazi sympathizers, cold and hostile and dangerous. Yet what he was witnessing seemed to contradict all of that training. The women kept stealing glances at him and his fellow guards, and then they would turn quickly away, their shoulders visibly shaking with what appeared unmistakably to be suppressed laughter. During a shift change, Tommy approached his commanding officer, Sergeant O'Reilly, with his concern weighing heavily on his mind. He explained that he thought something unusual was going on with the prisoners, because they kept looking at the guards funny, and then talking among themselves. He asked whether O'Reilly thought they might be planning some kind of escape attempt, or other form of resistance. The sergeant, who had been dealing extensively with German male prisoners for over a year before this assignment, studied the women's behavior carefully for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. His expression shifted gradually from concern to something that resembled amusement or understanding. He told Tommy slowly that he did not think the prisoners were planning an escape at all, and that instead he thought they were quite simply laughing at the guards. Tommy's confusion about this explanation deepened visibly on his young face. He repeated back that the prisoners were laughing at them, and he asked why on earth they would do such a thing. O'Reilly, who had spent enough time around people from different place and culture to recognize when someone was genuinely surprised by physical difference or cultural element unfamiliar to them, theorized that these German women had probably never seen American before in their life. Whatever they had been taught about their American enemy had clearly not prepared them adequately for the reality of well-fed tall farm boy and factory worker who towered over most people they had previously encountered. The propaganda campaign had failed spectacularly at this most basic and obvious level of physical description. O'Reilly explained his theory to Tommy in simple terms, that the younger man could understand and process. Tommy repeated back what he was hearing, saying, "So the prisoners thought that the American guards were big." O'Reilly nodded in confirmation and added that apparently they thought the guards were real big. Tommy did not know whether to feel offended by this assessment of the American guards or flattered by the implied admiration of their physical stature, so he settled instead on simply feeling confused by the entire bizarre situation unfolding before him. The real breakthrough in communication and understanding came on October 15th, during an afternoon work detail assignment in the camp's laundry facility. Greta, Liesel, and Frida had been assigned together to sort and fold military linens and bedding alongside 6 other prisoners working together. Sergeant O'Reilly stood positioned near the doorway to the facility, supervising the detail as required by strict camp regulations and military protocol. The women worked quietly and methodically at their assigned tasks, but Frida's natural tendency toward commentary and observation eventually got the better of her, despite her attempts to remain silent. She whispered quietly to Greta in German about how the sergeant had to duck slightly to fit through the doorway of the building, and she imagined aloud how many times he must hit his head on things throughout his daily life. She painted a funny mental picture of him trying to navigate a normal German house with its characteristically lower doorways and ceilings. The visual image was too absurd and funny, and Greta let out an unintended snort of laughter that she immediately regretted. O'Reilly's head turned sharply toward the sound that had broken through the quiet routine of the laundry work. The women immediately fell completely silent, focusing their attention intently back on folding the military linens before them. They had just broken what they understood to be an unspoken but important rule about not drawing direct attention to themselves or their activities. For what seemed like a very long moment, the sergeant simply watched them, his expression remaining completely unreadable and giving no clues to his emotional state. Then, to everyone's complete and utter surprise, he walked directly over to their work area. The women stiffened instinctively, preparing themselves for some kind of reprimand or punishment. Instead, O'Reilly did something completely unexpected that caught them entirely off guard. He smiled a genuine and warm smile that lit up his face. He addressed them in slow, clear English, speaking deliberately so they might possibly understand his words. He told them that he could tell when someone was talking about him, even if they were speaking in German or another foreign language. The women exchanged nervous glances with each other, completely unsure how they should respond, or even if they should attempt to respond at all. Freda, whose natural boldness had gotten them into this situation, made the decision to own what had happened rather than deny it. She had been diligently studying English phrases from a small textbook she had managed to keep hidden in her personal belongings throughout her captivity. Mustering every bit of courage she possessed, and relying on her limited but growing vocabulary, she looked up at the towering sergeant and said in heavily accented English that he was very tall and that they were surprised by his size. The simple honesty of the statement, delivered with such earnest effort at genuine communication across the language barrier, made O'Reilly laugh in response. It was a genuine, warm laugh that seemed to echo through the tense laundry room with unexpected humanity. It was the first time any of the women had heard an American guard laugh, and the sound was startlingly human and kind. The sergeant crouched down slightly to bring himself closer to eye level with the women so they could communicate more easily. He shared that where he came from in Chicago, a man of his size was perfectly normal, and that many men were tall in the United States. Then, with a grin spreading across his face, he asked whether they had been told that Americans were small. Greta, whose English was slightly better developed than Freda's from her radio operator training, nodded hesitantly in response. She admitted that yes, according to the propaganda they had received, Americans were supposed to be weak and small and not strong like German soldiers. She struggled with finding exactly the right English words to express her thought, but the meaning came across clearly nonetheless. O'Reilly's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful and serious as he began to understand the full magnitude of the deception these young women had lived under their entire lives. He spoke gently, telling them that he supposed the propaganda must have been a lie. The simplicity and truth of that statement hung in the air between them like a revelation. It represented an acknowledgement that both German and American propaganda machines had been feeding false information to their respective populations about each other. It represented a tiny moment of mutual recognition that all of them were human beings who had been manipulated by forces and systems far larger than themselves. For the first time since their capture, the German women felt something shift fundamentally in the camp atmosphere. It was not quite trust, but perhaps it was the very beginning of genuine understanding between people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. November 23, 1944, brought an event that would further dissolve the remaining barriers between captives and captors. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and the camp commander made the significant decision to authorize a special meal for all personnel, and after considerable debate and deliberation, decided that the German prisoners would be included in the celebration. Captain Elizabeth Warren took it upon herself to explain the concept of Thanksgiving to the assembled women through their official interpreter, describing it as a day when Americans traditionally gave thanks for the abundance and blessings they had received in their life. The women listened politely and with interest, but absolutely nothing could have prepared them for what actually appeared on their plates. That November afternoon, turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes with rich gravy, cranberry sauce, green beans, warm rolls with butter, and for dessert, pumpkin pie. It was more food than most of them had seen in a single meal in years, perhaps even in their entire lives. Liesel stared at her overflowing plate with something approaching complete disbelief. She whispered to Greta in German, asking whether this meal was truly for prisoners, and if so, what on earth did Americans feed their own soldiers? The question was not rhetorical or sarcastic. The contrast between what they had been told about American weakness and deprivation versus this vivid display of abundance was absolutely staggering and shocking. Around them throughout the mess hall, other women had similar reactions of amazement and wonder. Some of the prisoners ate very slowly, savoring every single bite as though they feared the meal might disappear. Others seemed almost afraid to touch the food at all, as if it might suddenly be taken away or revealed as some cruel trick or illusion. Frida, ever practical and pragmatic even in extraordinary circumstances, simply began eating with genuine enthusiasm and appreciation. She announced loudly to her table mates that if this was what prison in America meant, then perhaps they had been on the wrong side of the war all along. After the meal was concluded, the guards organized an impromptu recreation period in the yard outside the main camp buildings. Private Wilson had brought a football with him, thinking that some of the men on guard duty might want to toss it around during their break time. Instead, he found himself attempting to explain American football to a group of curious and enthusiastic German women who had ventured outside to walk off the enormous meal they had consumed. The football itself seemed to confuse the women greatly. Greta asked in her improving English why the ball was shaped that way, pointing at the oblong form, and wondered aloud why it was not round like a proper football. Wilson realized she meant soccer, or what Europeans called football. The explanation that followed involved a lot of hand gestures and physical demonstrations that ultimately left both parties more confused than when they had started the conversation. Sergeant O'Reilly decided to join the attempt to explain the rules and equipment, and he began tossing the football to Wilson in a gentle spiral motion to demonstrate proper throwing technique. The women watched the rotating ball move through the air with genuine fascination and wonder. Frida asked whether the ball was always thrown in that particular spinning manner, mimicking the spiral motion with her own hand to show she was trying to understand. O'Reilly nodded in confirmation and on impulse offered the ball directly to her. He asked whether she wanted to try throwing it herself. Frida hesitated, looking toward the other women as though seeking permission or encouragement from her friends. Liesel nodded and told her to go ahead, asking what the worst thing that could happen would be. Taking the football awkwardly in both of her hands, Frida attempted to throw it with the best form she could manage. The ball tumbled end over end through the air, traveling barely 10 feet before hitting the ground with a thud. The guards did not laugh at her or mock her failed attempt. Instead, Wilson jogged over to retrieve the ball and spent the next several minutes showing Frida the proper grip and the correct throwing motion. Soon, half a dozen German women were attempting to throw the strange American ball, and their throws gradually became slightly less awkward with each repeated attempt. The guards offered helpful tips and genuine encouragement to all of them, falling naturally into the role of coaches and mentors rather than captors or enemy soldiers. It was messy and chaotic, and it involved a lot of laughter from both prisoners and guards alike. In that golden moment under the warm Texas autumn sun, enemies had become simply people trying to understand each other's strange and foreign customs. December brought increasingly cold weather to the Texas region, and a subtle but profoundly significant shift began in the atmosphere of the camp. The initial jokes about the guards' impressive size had evolved into something considerably deeper and more meaningful. Real conversations, though still limited by language barriers and cultural differences, began to happen regularly during work details and organized recreation periods. Greta found herself increasingly drawn to these exchanges of ideas and information. Her English improved with remarkable speed each passing day, and with her improved language skills came the ability to ask questions that had been haunting her continuously since that first shocking moment of stepping off the transport truck and seeing the American guards. One afternoon in early December, she approached Sergeant O'Reilly during a supervised work detail in the camp library where prisoners assisted in organizing donated books and magazines. She began carefully, asking whether she might ask him something important. He nodded in encouragement and set down the stack of books he had been carrying so he could give her his full attention. Greta then asked him why the Americans had lied to them about something so obviously and easily verifiable as the physical size of American soldiers. She explained that when they arrived at the camp, they had been told that Americans were small and weak people, not like what she and the other women could clearly see with their own eyes. O'Reilly considered the question seriously, recognizing that it was more profound than it appeared on the surface. He pulled up a chair and motioned for Greta to sit beside him as well. He explained slowly that when people lie about small and obvious things, you stop questioning the bigger lies. If you believe Americans are weak, you believe Germany can win easily, and you do not ask hard questions about whether the war itself makes sense. Greta absorbed his words, her expression troubled and thoughtful. She asked quietly what else was lies, and what other things they had been told that turned out to be untrue. The sergeant's face grew more somber as he responded. He told her that was something she would have to figure out for herself, and that he could not tell her what to believe. However, he could tell her with certainty that the Americans had also been lied to about Germans. Americans had been told that all German people were monsters, all evil and irredeemable. He looked directly into her eyes and told her that she and her fellow prisoners were not monsters at all. They were simply people, young people who had gotten caught up in something far larger than they understood or could control. His words struck her with unexpected and profound force. The idea that both sides had been systematically deceived, that ordinary people on both sides were ultimately victims of manipulation and propaganda, was revolutionary to her understanding. That evening, Greta gathered several of the other women in their barracks after lights out. Speaking in hushed German in the darkness, she shared her conversation with O'Reilly and the revelation it had sparked. The discussion that followed lasted many hours deep into the night. Liesel raised the question that terrified all of them, asking if the Nazis had lied about Americans being weak. What about everything else? What about the reasons for the war itself? What about the things they were told they were fighting for? Frida, who was usually the source of levity and humor in the group, was uncharacteristically serious and somber. She admitted that she had been thinking about this question since Thanksgiving, because that meal and the abundance of food meant that they were feeding prisoners better than Germany had been feeding its own soldiers toward the end of the war. She asked what kind of weak and failing country would have the resources to feed prisoners so well. The women wrestled with a cognitive dissonance that was simultaneously painful and liberating. Every kind gesture from the guards, every display of American abundance and generosity, every moment of unexpected humanity chipped away at the foundation of everything they had believed to be true about the world. Anna Vogel, who had been largely silent throughout most of the discussion, finally spoke up in the darkness. She said quietly that she thought maybe the worst lie of all was telling them that questioning was wrong, that doubt was a sign of weakness. She suggested that perhaps that was how their leaders had kept them from seeing the truth around them. The women sat in complete darkness, each one processing in her own way the uncomfortable and troubling realization that their entire worldview had been built entirely on deception and lies. January 9, 1945, brought news that would shatter whatever remained of the German women's remaining illusions about their homeland and its leadership. American forces advancing through occupied Europe had begun making horrifying discoveries inside concentration camps, and the military was systematically documenting everything they found in meticulous detail. Camp Huntsville received newsreels and photographs that had been collected for a re-education program meant to be shown to German prisoners. Captain Warren debated long and hard whether it would be appropriate to show this material to the women prisoners. Unlike hardened SS officers or Wehrmacht soldiers who had served in combat, these auxiliary workers seemed genuinely and sincerely unaware of the Reich's darkest crimes. Captain Warren ultimately decided that these women deserved to know the truth about what they had unknowingly served, but she arranged carefully for the screening to happen in the presence of guards who had developed genuine rapport with the prisoners. The women filed into the recreation hall confused about why they had been called to a sudden assembly. A projector had been set up and Captain Warren stood before them with an expression of deep and somber seriousness. She told them through the interpreter that what they were about to see would be difficult, but that it was the truth. What they would see was what American soldiers had found in Germany and Poland. What they would witness was what the Nazi Reich had done. The lights dimmed and the newsreel began to play. Within minutes, the recreation hall filled with sounds of sobbing and gasping from the women. Images of Bergen-Belsen, of skeletal survivors barely alive, of mass graves filled with bodies, of the systematic machinery of industrial death flickered across the screen in stark black and white. The women sat absolutely frozen, their faces reflecting horror, disbelief, and the dawning comprehension of something too monstrous to fully grasp or comprehend. Greta felt her stomach turn violently. She had known that the Reich was harsh, had known about camps for political prisoners, but this systematic extermination on an industrial scale was beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Beside her, Laezel was weeping openly, her hands covering her mouth as if to hold back screams of anguish. Frida sat perfectly still, tears streaming silently down her face. When the newsreel finally ended, no one in the hall moved. The lights came back on, revealing a room full of women in various states of emotional collapse and shock. Some were crying silently. Some sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had seen. Others looked physically ill. The interpreter began to speak, but Captain Warren raised her hand to stop her and instructed everyone to let the women process this information quietly. Sergeant O'Reilly approached Greta, who was staring at nothing, her face pale as death. He crouched down beside her chair and spoke her name gently. She did not respond. He tried again, but still nothing. Finally, she turned slowly to look at him, and the anguish in her eyes was absolutely profound and heartbreaking. She whispered in English, asking how this could have happened in their country and how they could not have known about it. He had no answer that would comfort her or ease her pain. Their jokes about the American Guard's size seemed childish and trivial now, a lifetime ago rather than just 3 months prior. Everything had changed in the playing of that newsreel. They could never return to the innocence of not knowing, and the weight of that knowledge would shape every decision they made going forward for the rest of their lives. The weeks following the newsreel screening were without question the darkest period in the camp's recorded history. The German women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, mechanically performing their assigned tasks, but showing none of the curiosity or gradual warmth that had been steadily developing. The guards noticed the dramatic change immediately and did not know how to address it or help. Even the kindest gestures seemed utterly inadequate in the face of such profound grief and shame. By late January, Captain Warren was genuinely concerned about the overall mental state of all the prisoners. Some had stopped eating properly, while others barely spoke at all. The transformation from cautiously optimistic captives to deeply traumatized young women was absolutely heartbreaking to witness day after day. It was Greta who finally broke the cycle of despair, though not in any way that anyone could have predicted or anticipated. On February 3rd, she approached Sergeant O'Reilly with a request that caught him completely off guard. She said that she wanted to make a show, a performance for the guards and for the prisoners as well. She wanted to do comedy and music, anything that might help them remember how to laugh again. O'Reilly was deeply skeptical. A talent show seemed completely tone-deaf given what the women had just learned about their country's unforgivable crimes. But Greta's earnest expression and the sincerity in her eyes stopped his immediate refusal. She explained that they could not live in darkness forever. What they had learned was terrible and awful, but they were still alive. They must find a way to actually be alive, not just exist from day to day. The sergeant brought the idea to Captain Warren, who was equally uncertain and doubtful, but ultimately agreed. If the prisoners wanted to organize something positive, perhaps it would help in their recovery process. Permission was granted for a talent show to be held on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Though the irony of that particular date was completely lost on the German women who were unfamiliar with American holiday traditions. Greta threw herself into organizing the event with an intensity that surprised absolutely everyone. She recruited other prisoners, encouraging them to share any talents they possessed. Singing, comedy sketches, magic tricks, anything at all that might bring a moment of lightness to their heavy and difficult reality. Frida was reluctant at first, questioning how they could possibly perform comedy after what they had learned about the Holocaust. Greta's response was simple but profoundly meaningful. She told Frida that if they let evil steal their ability to laugh, to find joy, to be human, then the evil wins even after it has been defeated. They must show that they can acknowledge terrible truth and still choose to live fully and authentically. Her words resonated deeply with Frida and the others. Slowly, other women began participating in the preparations. Lazal, who had a beautiful singing voice, agreed to perform traditional German folk songs. Anna Vogel, who could do surprisingly good impressions of various people, prepared a gentle comedy routine. Even the quietest prisoners found small ways to contribute to the event. The preparations became a form of therapy for all of them. Women who had barely spoken in weeks began collaborating with each other, practicing their acts, and even laughing occasionally during rehearsals. The guards watched this transformation with genuine amazement. Private Wilson remarked to O'Reilly that it was like watching flowers bloom after a harsh frost. The Germans were choosing resilience over surrender, and in doing so they were teaching their American captors something profound about the human spirit's capacity to heal. The talent show on February 14th exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. The recreation hall was completely packed with guards, administrative staff, and all 43 German prisoners. Greta served as master of ceremonies, introducing each act in her now fluent English. Lazel sang German folk songs that moved several guards to tears despite not understanding the words. Freda performed a comedy sketch about her first encounter with American football that had both prisoners and guards laughing until their sides hurt. Anna's impressions of various camp personalities, done with affection rather than mockery, brought the house down. For 2 hours, the weight of history lifted just enough for everyone to breathe freely. After the show concluded, something fundamental had shifted in the camp dynamics. The barriers between guards and prisoners had become permeable in ways that made some of the camp leadership deeply uncomfortable. Private Wilson found himself having long conversations with Frida about their respective homes and childhoods. Discovering that they both grew up on farms and shared surprisingly similar childhood experiences despite being citizens of enemy nations. He taught her English idioms and she taught him German phrases, their friendship growing naturally from mutual respect and genuine curiosity. When other guards questioned whether he was getting too friendly with a prisoner, Wilson responded simply that she was a person deserving of dignity, not just a number in a camp roster. Sergeant O'Reilly and Greta developed a meaningful mentorship relationship that transcended the traditional prisoner-guard dynamic. She asked him about American democracy, about how a country with such racial and cultural diversity managed to function as a unified nation. He asked her about German culture before the Nazis took power, trying desperately to understand how a sophisticated and cultured society had fallen into such darkness and barbarism. Their conversations happened during work details, both of them acutely aware that they were being watched by others who disapproved of such obvious familiarity. But O'Reilly believed that showing these women a better way, treating them with genuine respect, and engaging their minds and intellects was vastly more effective than any punishment or harsh treatment could ever be. By March, several of the German women had begun expressing a desire that absolutely shocked camp administrators and higher military officials. They wanted to stay in America. Greta was the first to voice it publicly during an official meeting with Captain Warren. She explained that she had no family left in Germany, and that the country she had known no longer existed. She said that here in the camp, she had learned what freedom and dignity truly meant, and that she had become a better person than she ever was under Nazi rule. The captain listened with growing concern about the legal and diplomatic implications that such a request would create. The news spread quickly through the camp and beyond its gates to the outside world. Some guards supported the women's requests, arguing they had proven their genuine transformation and deserved a chance at new lives in America. Others, particularly those who had lost close friends or family members in the war against Germany, felt it was completely inappropriate for enemy nationals to remain on American soil. The debate grew heated and passionate. Newspapers picked up the story, and the women at Camp Huntsville became powerful symbols in a larger national conversation about forgiveness, redemption, and what America owed to former enemies who had genuinely changed their beliefs. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day arrived with deeply mixed emotions at Camp Huntsville. While Americans across the entire country celebrated in the streets with jubilation, the German women prisoners faced the stark reality of repatriation back to their homeland. Official orders had come down directly from Washington. Most of the women would be returned to Germany within weeks, processed through displaced persons camps before being released to whatever remained of their former lives and homes. Captain Warren called a General Assembly on May 15th to announce the official details. The The 43 women gathered in the recreation hall, where just 3 months earlier they had performed their triumphant talent show. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and dread. Warren announced that transportation would be arranged by month's end. The women would be given documentation, basic supplies, and passage to European ports. From there, they would be processed and ultimately released to return to their homes. She paused, her voice softening considerably as she continued. She wanted them to know that their behavior throughout their captivity had been exemplary, and that they had shown remarkable growth and dignity. Several women began crying quietly at the announcement. Greta raised her hand, speaking in clear English without waiting for translation. She asked Captain Warren what would happen to those of them who had requested to remain in America. The question hung in the air between them like a sword. Warren's expression showed the visible strain of the impossible situation she was facing. She said carefully that the requests were under review at the highest levels, but she could not make promises. Most of them would need to prepare for repatriation. The finality of those words struck like a physical blow to all of them. Liesl buried her face in her hands. Freda stared at the floor, her usual humor completely absent. Even the guards looked uncomfortable, several of them visibly upset at the prospect of sending these women back to a devastated country where they had no family and uncertain futures. Private Wilson stood near the back, his jaw clenched tightly, clearly struggling with emotions he could not express in his official capacity as a military guard. That evening, the women gathered in small groups throughout their barracks to discuss their limited options and possibilities. Most had accepted the hard reality of their situation and knew they would need to face Germany's ruins with whatever courage they could summon. But 9 women, led by the determined Greta, made a collective decision that would define their futures. They would formally petition the American government for refugee status, arguing that they had no homes to return to in a devastated Germany, and that they had demonstrated genuine and sincere commitment to democratic values and freedom. It was an unprecedented request, legally complicated, and almost certainly a long shot, but they felt they had to try with every ounce of energy they possessed. Sergeant O'Reilly helped the 9 women draft their petition, working late into the night in the camp office to articulate their case in proper legal language and terminology. The following weeks were agonizing in their uncertainty. Day after day passed with no response from Washington, while preparations continued methodically for the mass repatriation of the majority of the prisoners. The women who had decided to accept the reality of return began saying their emotional goodbyes to the guards who had become friends and confidants. Gifts were exchanged between them, addresses were written down on scraps of paper with promises to write letters and maintain contact. Private Wilson gave Freda his home address in Alabama, telling her with emotion thick in his voice that if she ever managed to make it to America, she would have family there waiting for her. She embraced him, and both of them cried openly, no longer caring who saw them or what military regulations they might be violating. June 20th, 1945, brought the day of repatriation that everyone had been dreading. 34 women boarded transport trucks bound for the port in Houston, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination mixed with sadness about leaving their new friends. They carried letters of recommendation from Captain Warren and personal notes from guards who had become genuine friends during their time together. These women would return to a devastated Germany as ambassadors of an unexpected truth, that enemies could become human to each other across the barriers of war and propaganda. That transformation and change were possible, even in the darkest circumstances imaginable. The 9 women who had petitioned to stay watched their friends depart from the camp, uncertain if they would ever see them again. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. 3 days later, a telegram arrived from Washington with news that would change their lives forever in ways they could not have imagined. The petition had been approved. The 9 women would be granted provisional refugee status and allowed to remain in the United States under sponsor supervision with a viable path to eventual citizenship. The celebration in the camp was jubilant, but bittersweet in its emotional complexity. They had won their freedom to stay, but at the cost of separation from friends who had shared their entire journey together. Greta stood in the now half-empty barracks, holding the official papers that granted her a new life and new identity. Sergeant O'Reilly found her there, tears streaming down her face. She assured him that these were happy tears, but also sad ones, simultaneously. She had lost one home and gained another in exchange. The sergeant understood her feelings completely and deeply. The 9 women scattered across America in the months that followed, each determined to build new lives with remarkable grace and resilience. Greta became a translator for the State Department, eventually marrying an American diplomat and raising 3 children who grew up bilingual in German and English. Freda moved to Alabama, where Private Tommy Wilson's family welcomed her like a beloved daughter. She and Tommy married in 1947, and their wedding became a symbol of reconciliation that made local newspapers throughout the South. Liesl pursued a career in nursing, working at a veterans hospital where she cared for American soldiers who had fought against her countrymen. Her gentle compassion became legendary among patients and staff alike. The other women found their own paths, each contributing meaningfully to their adopted country, while never forgetting where they came from or who they had been. But the story's most remarkable chapter came in October 1970. Greta, now in her late 40s, organized a reunion at the site of the former Camp Huntsville. 31 of the original 43 women returned to the camp, traveling from Germany and across various states in America. Sergeant Michael O'Reilly, now retired with gray hair, attended with his wife by his side. Captain Elizabeth Warren, long since having left military service, came to see the women whose lives had intersected with hers so profoundly during the war years. Private Tommy Wilson arrived with Freda and their 4 children, living proof that former enemies could build families together and create new legacies. They gathered in what had been the recreation hall, now repurposed as a community center for the local area. Stories were shared between them, tears were shed openly, and yes, there was genuine laughter. Freda, her humor completely undimmed by 25 years of passage, made a joke about Sergeant O'Reilly's impressive height that brought the house down just as it had decades earlier. In that moment, surrounded by people who had once been divided by war, but were now united by shared history and genuine affection for each other, the true victory became crystal clear. It was not the military victory of 1945 that mattered most. It was the human victory of choosing understanding over hatred, redemption over revenge, and laughter over despair. The story of the German POW women and their American guards proved conclusively that even in humanity's darkest hours, kindness and humor could build bridges across any divide, no matter how deep or seemingly insurmountable. What began as a moment of cultural shock and laughter at physical differences had evolved into something far more profound and lasting. It had become a testament to the power of seeing the humanity in those we are taught to hate. It had demonstrated that ordinary people on both sides of any conflict are capable of extraordinary compassion and change. The legacy of Camp Huntsville lived on through the children and grandchildren of these women and men, a living reminder that war divides nations but cannot permanently destroy the fundamental human capacity for connection and understanding. Greta's bilingual children grew up learning not just their mother's language, but her stories about the American Guards, who showed her what freedom truly meant. Freda's 4 children carried forward the narrative of their mother's unlikely journey from enemy soldier to beloved family member. Each of the 9 women who remained in America became a bridge between 2 nations, between past enemies, between the darkness of war and the light of peace. The camp itself eventually closed, its buildings repurposed or demolished, but the memory of what happened there endured. Historians would later cite Camp Huntsville as an example of how human connection could transcend the artificial divisions created by governments and propaganda. The story became required reading in some schools, taught as a lesson in the power of empathy and the danger of dehumanizing propaganda. Veterans who had served as guards at the camp spoke about it in their later years, marveling at how something so ordinary, so human as a group of people laughing at physical differences, had become the foundation for lifelong friendships that spanned oceans and decades. Years after the war ended, when historians and journalists interviewed the surviving women, they often asked what moment had truly transformed their understanding. Many pointed back to that first laugh, to Freda's joke about Sergeant O'Reilly's height. In that simple moment of humor and absurdity, the wall of propaganda had cracked just enough for light to shine through. The women explained that laughter had been their first act of rebellion against lies. It had been their way of reclaiming their humanity in a situation designed to strip it away. What they had been taught to believe about Americans, what Americans had been taught to believe about Germans, all of it had been challenged in the face of ordinary human interaction. The letters that these women and men wrote to each other over the decades after the war speak volumes about the depths of connection they had forged. Sergeant O'Reilly's letters to Greta became almost philosophical, exploring ideas about justice, redemption, and what it meant to be human. Freda's letters to Tommy Wilson were filled with descriptions of Alabama and her amazement at American life, but also with homesickness for her native Germany and gratitude that she had been allowed to build a new life. These letters, many of which were preserved and eventually shared with historical societies, provide an intimate window into how ordinary people processed extraordinary circumstances. The German women who had returned to Germany also maintained contact with the camp. Many of them wrote about the devastation they found, the difficulty of rebuilding their lives in a country destroyed by war. Yet nearly all of them expressed gratitude that they had experienced Camp Huntsville, that they had seen kindness from Americans, that they had witnessed an alternative to the hatred that had defined their youth. Some of them eventually emigrated to America to rejoin their friends. Others remained in Germany but became voices for reconciliation and understanding between the nations. They shared their stories in schools and civic organizations, became advocates for peace, and dedicated their lives to ensuring that the kind of propaganda that had deceived them could not take hold again. The legacy of these women extended far beyond their own lifetime. Their children and grandchildren grew up with stories of unexpected friendship, of enemies becoming family, of how laughter could bridge seemingly impossible gaps. Many of them became diplomats, teachers, social workers, and activists, all influenced in some way by their parents' or grandparents' experiences at Camp Huntsville. The German women who had made the remarkable journey to America became naturalized citizens, but they never forgot their origins or the country that had birthed them before the darkness came. They celebrated both German and American traditions, passing on cultural knowledge to the next generation, while also instilling deeply held values about peace, reconciliation, and the danger of dehumanization. The annual reunions that had begun in 1970 continued for many years. Each one drew more people, including the children and grandchildren of the original guards and prisoners. The gatherings became a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to the place where the unexpected had happened, where enemies had learned to see each other as human. The attendees would walk the grounds of what had been the camp, telling stories, sharing memories, and reinforcing the bonds that had been forged across the lines of war. As the years passed and the world changed, the story of Camp Huntsville remained remarkably relevant. In each new generation, people learned about this moment of human connection and drew inspiration from it. The story challenged the notion that conflict was inevitable, that enemies must remain enemies, that understanding across divides was impossible. It offered proof that even in the midst of war, even between people trained to hate each other, connection was possible. It demonstrated that small acts of kindness, a moment of shared laughter, a willingness to see the humanity in another person, could have consequences that rippled through decades and changed lives forever. The German women at Camp Huntsville had arrived expecting cruelty and humiliation. Instead, they had found unexpected kindness, genuine curiosity, and the beginnings of authentic friendship. Their American guards had been trained to see them as the enemy, yet they had chosen to see them as young women far from home. That choice, repeated in small moments day after day, had created something extraordinary. It had created a bridge of human connection that war could not destroy. It had created memories and relationships that lasted lifetimes. It had created a legacy of reconciliation that continued to inspire generations. In the end, the story of the German POW women and their American guards became more than just a historical anecdote. It became a statement about the fundamental resilience of the human spirit, the power of empathy, and the possibility of transformation even in the darkest moments. It was a story that reminded people that beneath uniforms and propaganda, beneath nations and ideologies, there were simply human beings with the capacity to connect, to understand, and to change. The women who had joked about the size of American guards had learned something far more valuable than any piece of propaganda could teach. They had learned that their enemy was not an enemy at all, but a fellow human being worthy of respect and friendship. And that lesson, learned in a small camp in Texas during wartime, had the power to echo through history and touch the hearts of countless generations to come.